So our wonderful, beautiful, perfect George R. R. Martin, who is just flawless in every way, you just can't be angry at the man, recently did a podcast where he shared some information on Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire / House of the Dragon. And because I stalk the man and I have Google alerts anytime George's name comes up, I'm not even joking about that. It sends it right to my email. I got it, and I instantly just freaked out. So I want to share that information with you and just talk about it a little bit. Okay, I just want to jump right into it. First, we were told by George that we're getting 17 dragons. 17 dragons in House of the Dragon. George also hoped that they will be recognizable, so each one will be distinct and have its own personality. And Ryan Condal, who is one of the hosts of the podcast and executive producer on House of the Dragon, said they are working very, very hard on that. Now, if you know the Dance of the Dragon story, which is what House of the Dragon is covering, you know that there were more than 17 dragons that fought in the war. So this might just be George saying a general, like, 17 dragons, just to throw a number out there. Or, maybe there won't be 20 plus dragons that were, around during that time. Not necessarily all of them fought, but were around. So I wouldn't take that to heart and be like, we're only getting 17 dragons. Which 4 are they cutting out? It just could be him throwing out a big number. Or George just legitimately forgot how many dragons were in the Dance of the Dragons, because George forgets a lot of things. I understand, George. I'm elderly too. I wouldn't necessarily be bummed out if we didn't see all the dragons, but I don't know. I'm just kind of focusing on the fact that they are going to have so many dragons, and on the fact that they're trying to make each one distinct and have its own personality, and I really hope people can get attached to each dragon like they do characters. Because I'm not saying D&D failed at making each dragon distinct in the main series. I mean, there were some personality traits, but overall, Next, and this one is kind of a contradiction, so he talked about how he actually pitched Dunk and Egg to HBO as one of the successor shows to be put on, and HBO was like, no, we're not interested. And why I say this is a bit of a contradiction, because this is what George said before, which makes it sound like it happened completely different. We're not doing Dunk and Egg. Eventually, sure. I'd love that. And so would many of you. But I've only written and published 3 novellas to date, and there are at least 7 or 8 or 10 more I want to write. We all know how slow I am, and how fast a television show can move. I don't want to repeat what happened with Game of Thrones itself, where the show gets ahead of the books. When the day comes that I've finished telling all my tales of Dunk and Egg, then we'll do a TV show about them. But that day is still a long ways off. So he makes it sound like he was the one that said, hey, I do not want to do Dunk and Egg stories right now because I'm really worried that I won't be able to finish them in time and you guys will get ahead of my stories. Where when he talks on this podcast recently, he's like, yeah, I tried, I pitched it, and they were, nah. But continuing on, because this next part, I want to say is weird, but it's actually maybe a little bit infuriating. Not too much, because, obviously there are worse things going on in the world. But George talked about how when HBO was picking writers for pitching the pilots for different successor shows, most of the writers had not read the books and had no idea about George's A Song of Ice and Fire world. And they had only seen the main show and went, wow, I really like this. I'd like to make a spinoff about something. That just seems really wrong. Like, if you are going to write about a world and create a live action version, even if it's different, I'd assume you've read the source material, You're just not going in there and going, oh man, I watched this show and it was so dope, and now I'm just gonna make some spin-offs about it. Which is why George actually likes Ryan Condal so much, because Ryan Condal, for many decades, has been into the A Song of Ice and Fire series. He's read everything. He's very versed in the lore, so him writing, being executive producer for House of the Dragon, makes sense, and it's very comforting, both to George and to me, and hopefully to you, that he loves the A Song of Ice and Fire material. And what's kind of funny about that is 3 years ago, George and Ryan together actually busted out the pilot for House of the Dragon. So not only has George known him for a while, is good friends with him, and Ryan is very familiar with his works, but they worked on making the pilot for House of the Dragon, and that makes me even happier. So this next part I'm going to talk about is about Game of Thrones and George, but then it does kind of segue into House of the Dragon. So if you're like, okay, are you done talking about House of the Dragon? I'm not, but I have a segue that I want to use. It's not a good one, so don't like feel like I'm hyping you up. It's just how I listed the information, and I didn't want to change it around. So, George does have some regrets about Game of Thrones. Of course, he's said quite a few. One of them is that he didn't get to have his severed head next to Ned's, after he's beheaded, and then Joffrey brings Sansa out to look at it. George really, really wanted his severed head up there. Not his actual severed head, obviously, but a recreation of his head. And D&D actually said, hey, we want our heads up there too. But unfortunately, it was season 1. They didn't have a really good budget, and it's expensive. It takes a lot of time to make a head and exactly like a person. So they ended up using used severed heads that they bought. And this goes into kind of a funny story that I'm sure you know, that one of the severed heads was actually George W. Bush, and they put a wig on him. And at the time, George did not know that was George W. Bush lookalike severed head, because it was bald, and then they put a wig on it. And it wasn't until the director of that episode did commentary and said, oh yeah, and if you look here, this is George W. Bush, that people freaked out. I guess there were a lot of right-wing people just saying, this show needs to be canceled, this is so disrespectful. I think it's a little bit funny, especially that George just had no idea, and then after the fact was like, oh no. Okay, here's my segue. But speaking of severed heads, it's been confirmed that we're getting a lot of severed heads in House of the Dragon, which is kind of expected. It's a civil war. There's going to be a lot of prisoners, a lot of people that are defeated, a lot of, killing. I would assume we'd see a lot of beheadings. And what makes this even better is that Ryan Condal told George, hey, this time we are getting a replica of your severed head in House of the Dragon. George, you deserve it, you beautiful angel. But continuing on and connecting severed heads, it was confirmed that we're getting both Dark Sister and Blackfyre in House of the Dragon. Now, in the lore, both swords are there, and if you don't know them, they're just two ancestral House Targaryen Valyrian swords. Really important, cause quite a bit of issues. Well, Blackfyre causes the most issues. And in the lore, Dark Sister belongs to Daemon Targaryen at the time, and Blackfyre belongs to Aegon II. So if you were worried we wouldn't see Blackfyre and Dark Sister, we definitely are. There, of course, have been leaks already of Dark Sister. I think I talked about it, but that was months ago. And George said if his head were to be lopped off in House of the Dragon, he would prefer it to be done by Blackfyre because it would be a cleaner cut. Obviously, Dark Sister is a slimmer blade. Though, I feel like Daemon Targaryen could take off his head in one slash. So last little bit of information we were given, 3 more things I think I have listed. I'm not going to look down right now. George was given one of Dany's dragon eggs as a, hey, here's something from Game of Thrones. So D&D picked out what eggs they wanted first, and the black one was left over, so George ended up getting Drogon's egg. Kind of wish he got more, but I wasn't there. I don't know what went on. So if you feel bad for him, Jalek, who does the Valyrian steel, so he made a deal with George, hey, I'm going to replicate the swords from the books and sell them, and they have a whole deal worked out where every single sword copy from the books that he makes ends up giving one to George. So George actually has a lot of swords that are based on his A Song of Ice and Fire books, even if he didn't get a lot of stuff from the main show. Though it should be noted that Jalek then did make a deal with HBO where he could make the show swords as well. Lastly, you may not have known that 2 different people did the audio for A Feast with Crows. First, John Lee did it because Roy Joyce, he just didn't have the time, and fans just freaked out. They wanted Roy to do it, so Roy ended up coming back and redoing the audio. So we actually have 2 different authors who did the audio for Feast with Crows, which I think is pretty interesting. Also, fans freaking out? No. Would never happen. Fans would never throw a temper tantrum. Especially about something as silly as who narrated a book. I don't believe it. Okay, that is your George news. Like, subscribe, let me know what you are most excited about. What he shared about House of the Dragon, does it have you super excited? As excited as me. I don't know if you could be as excited as me, but maybe you are. And please, if you have any praise for George R. Martin and just the beautiful, magnificent human being he is, write it in the comment section down below.